Hi everyone, I'm Zara. I've just finished up my BA in Ancient History at King's College London, and my presentation today is based on the study of my undergraduate dissertation, which is the very wordy title, How Have Modern Playwrights Responded to the Place of Antigone in the Universalisation of the Ancient Greeks in European Thought? So I assume that most people here have a knowledge of the story of Antigone, but I'm aware that some of our audience members may not. So I thought I would just give a very, very brief, very basic introduction so we all have a working understanding. So Antigone is a tragedy written by Sophocles in or just before 441 BC. The play was most likely performed as part of the city Dionysia in Athens. Asia was mentioning this. This was a large festival in Athens honoring the god Dionysus. Part of this festival was where playwrights would compete with each other and perform their tragedies to an audience. Oh dear. In terms of events, Antigone comes last in the cycle of the three Theban plays. So these are three plays written by Sophocles, the other two being Oedipus the King and Oedipus at Colonus. And in total, this cycle is about the fate of Thebes during and after the reign of King Oedipus, who we hopefully all know about. Antigone is a daughter born of the unwittingly incestuous union between Oedipus and his mother Jocasta, and in this tragedy she attempts to secure a respectable burial for her brother Polynices, who died in a civil war against their other brother Eteocles. King Creon decrees that Polynices is not to be buried or even mourned. Antigone defies the king's orders and buries her brother, and for that she's sentenced to death, although King Creon, who's also her uncle, later realizes he was maybe wrong and tries to save her. He realizes it's too late and she's hanged herself. So an introduction. I thought I would start by answering the latter half of my question, which is the place of Antigone in the universalization of the ancient Greeks first. Antigone was first reserved for commentary by 19th and early 20th century European philosophers and poets. The most famous of these commentators is undoubtedly Hegel, who analysed Antigone in his foundational text, Phenomenology of Spirit. There he is, looking quite terrifying, perhaps. And for Hegel, the main tragedy of the Antigone arises between this discord between Antigone, on the one hand, who represents the private laws of the family, and Creon on the other, who represents the public laws of the state. And Hegel sees this dialectic between them as this really, really important moment in the history of human culture, where Antigone is representative of this timeless woman figure and signifies a stage of development that humanity constantly had to try and work through to continue on our furthering development. Intellectuals like Hegel, Nietzsche, Freud are all part of an older humanist tradition originating in the Renaissance that sees ancient Greece as a locus of universal timeless values. And I should mention here that ancient Greece is specifically Athens in the 5th century BC. Every playwright who engages with Antigone in some way is responding to this Hegelian interpretation of her. In the 21st century, Antigone has become a foundational text for modern playwrights, feminists, political theorists, activists, and a very recognizable symbol of political resistance against a dominant order. So I'm really interested in thinking about how Antigone, part of this corpus that's historically bound to Athens in the 5th century BC, became transportable firstly around the Mediterranean world and then the world beyond, and how in the face of this universalization of the ancient Greeks, how has Antigone provided a really interesting space for marginalized groups to think about, question, and problematize their identities. So in order to do this, we need to very quickly look at the history of the classical tradition. So if you read any history of classics that's older than 15 years, you'll know that the traditional way of thinking about the history of the classical tradition is in the context of academic specialization, professionalization, and the rise of the university in the 19th century in conjunction with the imperial nation state. And what I mean by this is that at the beginning of the 19th century, most middle-class British people would have a workable knowledge of classics and Greco-Roman antiquity. But by the end of the 19th century, classics have become this really, really specialized discipline studied by kind of a few so-called intellectual and cultural elites. This happened because if you went to university at the beginning of the 19th century, you didn't actually study one subject, you would study a range of subjects and you would kind of graduate with a certificate in theology, classics, fencing, things like that. But it was only by the end of the 19th century that people actually went to university to study one specific subject and would graduate in that subject. So historically, that's actually a really recent thing. this kind of professionalization, universalisation is talked about by Christopher Stray in his book Classics Transformed, and he details the very literal debates that were going on in Oxford, Cambridge and London as classics was becoming a discipline. However, these accounts reflect a really well-known story about classics by the state of classics by the 20th century. And that's, as I said, that it had become a specialized discipline studied by a few so-called intellectual and cultural elites who relied on this really romanticized notion of Greece as this idealized founding of Western theatre, politics, philosophy, and literature. I should also note that this idea of Greece is really historically and geographically inaccurate. Historically inaccurate because Greece, ancient Greece really covers time periods from the Archaic period in 8th century BC to the Roman conquest in 146 BC, and geographically because ancient Greece was made up of colonies outside of today's modern borders, such as southern Italy, Sicily, Asia Minor, and then later Egypt and Libya. And of course, classics, colonialism and imperialism. As Greece came to be seen as a legitimization of Western culture and European intellectual thought, the specificity of its historical context was misrepresented to serve a Eurocentric logic. And what I mean by this is that classical antiquity was part of a justification for imperialism and was used in everyday colonial addenda, language, vocabulary, thought. The British Empire in part was modeled on the Roman Empire, and classics was really a way in which colonialism justified itself and articulated itself. And I just want to kind of tease out the ironies of this, that colonialism was at once dependent on classics, but it was also the British Empire, which through its exportation of classical learning, classical knowledge, its colonizing of different curricula around the world, this is what brought kind of non-traditional agents of the discipline, i.e. people who didn't work within the Western profession, into contact with classics, which led to the very questioning of the discipline itself, as you'll see in the plays I'm just about to talk about. So I'm really interested in looking at people who didn't work within the profession in colonial and post-colonial periods, who are now reclaiming Greco-Roman antiquity away from its colonizing, imperializing messages, and thinking about how this can offer different ways of thinking about history, politics, race, and gender. So the three plays, we're going to look at three plays that offer really interesting examples for various actors and agents to participate in the classical tradition and offer a really interesting original way of thinking about race and gender and the globalization of the discipline in the 1945 period. So the first is The Antigone by Jean Anouilh. He's a French playwright, and this play was produced in Nazi-occupied Paris in the 1940s. The second is The Island by Athol Fugard, John Canny, and Winston Oshona. And this is about two prisoners of apartheid in South Africa in the 1970s. And Antigone and Ferguson, which is created by Brian Dory's Theatre of War Company, an American theatre company, in conjunction with the wider community, created in response to the killing of Michael Brown, a African-American teenager who was shot and killed by a white police officer in 2014. Jean Anouilh's Antigone. As I said, it was premiered in Nazi-occupied Paris, specifically in 1944. This production really can be credited to putting Antigone onto the global stage. It's probably the most famous adaptation of Antigone ever, and probably also the closest to the Sophoclean text. But the production has had a really, really interesting reception history. When it was first produced, it was actually embraced by the collaborationist press. Antigone was seen as this fascist heroine. The play was seen as a fascist apology. And that's really interesting when we think of the Nazi appropriation of Greco-Roman antiquity, which can be seen as this culmination of the universalization of the ancient Greeks to an imperial Western hegemonic narrative. So is it an issue that Antigone can at once be seen as a fascist heroine, when at the same time, as we'll see in post-colonial context, she also can come to stand for very anti-racist ideals. But then as France came out of World War II, as the liberation happened, this play was increasingly associated with the resistance, and Antigone's defiance towards Créance was seen as a sign of real sustained resistance in France. So my aim was not to say which interpretation was correct, which one was more convincing, just that by looking at the text itself, both are entirely possible. And this makes it hardly surprising that the play that brought Antigone to global attention in theatre can assist scholars to think about other responses to Sophocles' text, which are themselves also contested, ambivalent, and riven. One such example, as we just mentioned, is The Island. And we can really see the impact that Anouilh's Antigone had on playwrights by looking at this quote by Fugard himself, which is, I'll read it out. Jean Anouilh produced a version of Antigone in Paris. In an exact parallel to the situation on Robben Island, the first 5 rows of German jackbooted officers admired what they thought was a straightforward piece of classical culture, but the French audience behind them knew what it was about. So The Island was produced in 1972. It's about the story and resistance of 2 prisoners, John and Winston, of apartheid, who were incarcerated on Robben Island, which is a maximum security prison off the coast of Cape Town. It's where Nelson Mandela was imprisoned during apartheid. And very interestingly, he also was in a production of the Antigone on Robben Island himself, which is in part what this play, The Island, is inspired by. I talk about the themes of rewriting and Henry Louis Gates in my dissertation, just to show and express the presence and the importance of a Black classicism. So Henry Louis Gates is an African-American literary critic. He argues that there's a recognizable African and African-American literary tradition. And I used his argument in my dissertation to show that contrary to those who see Greco-Roman antiquity in the hands of the West, there is a field of Black classicism. People who have been racialized as Black have been part of the classical tradition and have had a really, really important part to play. This is clearest in the theme of rewriting in the play. At the very end of the play, Winston, as you can see in the bottom picture in this wig, he comes out dressed as Antigone Emperor and performs this large monologue. And this is so interesting because it's a Black man dressed as a white woman, coming onto the stage and using the Antigone to explore really anti-apartheid politics. And I think this really forces the audience to reconsider this Eurocentrism of Western classicism and demands kind of a reconsideration of who owns classical antiquity, and forces us to rethink Antigone's representational status. So now Antigone and Ferguson, as we said, it's by Brian Dory's The Theatre of All Productions, which is his theatre company, and the wider community. Antigone and Ferguson was first performed in 2016, as we said, as a response to the shooting of Michael Brown in 2014. Of course, this is an event that is more important now than ever in the context of Black Lives Matter in the past year. And that's what made writing this dissertation so interesting. Of course, COVID-19 as well, which has had a disproportionate effect on Black and brown communities, and the presidency of Donald Trump, which has legitimated the rise of the alt-right, who weaponize classics to further white supremacist and white nationalist agendas. So Antigone and Ferguson is where actors sit down at a table, read the play of Antigone, and then the audience themselves are invited to talk about the production and talk about what their meanings and their kind of take on it are. And this is really in the style of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is the process by which South Africa transitioned from apartheid to a non-racial democracy. The processes of the TRC were where perpetrators and victims of apartheid were invited in public to sit down and talk about their experiences. And in the same way, Antigone and Ferguson has police officers and activists, members of people who have lost, family members of people who have lost their lives to police brutality, all sit down and discuss the action of Antigone. The production moves away from this family-state dichotomy and allows audiences to think about the possibilities of individual and collective agency in the faces of structural racism. So unlike traditional Greek tragedy, Antigone and Ferguson is not at all about the struggles of an existential hero, battling and confronting fate within a unified plot that's designed to produce fear and pity in the audience. Rather, it's an open-ending and involving tragic confrontation with institutional problems that require a collective response to bring about meaningful change. The chorus itself is just one element I wanted to quickly bring up. It's highly multifaceted. It's made up of members of police choirs, family members of people who have lost their lives to police brutality, members of Michael Brown's church, his teachers, and it's demonstrating the African-American culture represented in this play by gospel music can be used to rediscover the power of Greek tragedy and can be deployed to think about and articulate maybe a new politics and a way to move forward and a way to talk about Black Lives Matter and the problems of police brutality in America. So just some concluding remarks. I think we've seen the extent to which these playwrights destabilize the universalisation of the ancient Greeks. All three playwrights question, subvert, and problematize Sophocles' narrative in order to express their own identity politics, a politics which in all cases has emerged as a result of Western imperialism, colonialism, and white supremacy. Antigone is not universal because of this timelessness of ancient Greece or ancient Greek tragedy, but because of a political economic structure that has circulated and disseminated texts around the world since the 19th century. When responding to the universalisation of the ancient Greeks, modern playwrights fundamentally react to the processes which put Antigone onto the global stage in general. And from the 1940s onwards, playwrights have been continuously engaging, questioning, and deconstructing the universalisation of the ancient Greeks in the place of Antigone in this universal humanism. I think they offer a really interesting and original way to think about race and gender in the modern period. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Zara. That's a really, really great presentation. And again, another really, really interesting presentation around receptions of Greek tragedy. Yeah, again, welcoming questions in the chat, but otherwise I'll ask one or two of my own. Yeah, one question I sort of wanted to ask is why you feel that you think that maybe Antigone is a play that's lended itself to these kinds of questions of identity. I mean, given that obviously you've got, I mean, obviously that it's been received in a certain way, but obviously Greek plays, like you were touching on towards the end, often deals with questions of identity, self-determination, and so on. Why do you think Antigone has inspired all this thought rather than, say, I don't know, Bacchae, Persians, Hippolytus?
Yeah, definitely. I think one reason is the fact that she is a woman and the play is kind of about, I mean, at the time, you know, I don't think they would have seen it as this kind of feminist interpretation, but that it's a woman standing up to this dominant political order. And I think that is something that really resonated a lot with modern political theorists and feminists, and one of the reasons why she's really been put on stage. And I think another reason is also the ambiguity. As we've seen, she can stand for Nazism, fascism, all ends of the political spectrum, and that's because you can both at once identify with Creon and you can identify with Antigone, and you know there's no kind of right or wrong. It's very, you know, not one person is right, not one person is wrong, and I think that makes for a really interesting way to problematize identity and, you know, question these hegemonic narratives.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just another question following on from that, I suppose, what do you think of the character of Antigone herself? I mean, I read the play a while ago, but from what I remember, she sort of her own motivations are often seem more personal than political, and or even religious, you know, her wish to see her brother buried, and yet she has become this kind of revolutionary figure who, you know, but her own, but maybe her own motivations don't sort of aren't quite as revolutionary. I mean, has that played into any of this, do you think?
Definitely, and specifically the first play, I think one reason why it can be seen as non-resistive is because Antigone is shown to be really kind of childlike, and repeatedly she says, I don't know why I'm doing this, I just feel like I have to, and it's her motivations don't really maybe seem clear or kind of as bold as you might think, but I think that, you know, whether it's unfortunately or not, I think the part of classical reception studies is the fact that Sophocles' text can't stand alone from all of its adaptations, you know, whether that was the intention of the playwright or not, and whether in the original text Antigone is this kind of bold resistive figure. Most likely not, but there's kind of this dialogue that needs to be going on between Sophocles' text and all these other adaptations, and they really inform each other, and there's kind of like a bi-directional conversation going on.
Yeah, definitely. And then maybe just two last questions, and then let's make sure we can try and get a bit of a break for lunch. I think we'll probably end up moving things slightly forward. Tony has asked, do you think, I mean, how do you think that this, how would this have sort of played out in the minds of the Athenian audience? I mean, this kind of fight between your loyalty to family versus the polis. Were there any questions, you know, do you feel that those ideas might have been seen as dangerous to an Athenian audience? Maybe a place for those things to play out on stage to actually discuss them, or how do you think they sort of played out in practice? I mean, based on what you've read.
No, definitely. I definitely do think they are dangerous ideas. And I think, you know, as we all know, one way to kind of express a dangerous idea is to kind of put it down as a play, because then you're talking about it, but you're at the same time not talking about it. And I think the kind of only way that it was not seen as totally revolutionary and totally subaltern in Athens at the time is because this Antigone as a woman was not taken seriously at all. As we know, like all characters on stage would have been played by men at the time. Antigone would not have been played by a woman, and it probably would have more been kind of a satirical, ridiculing kind of piece rather than, as we see today, this resistive ideology.
Yeah, and partly the fact, you know, that she's not looking to do this as a revolutionary action. I'm sure that plays into that as well.
Exactly.
And then just a final question, just obviously we focus specifically on the Antigone, but are there other plays or pieces of literature that you have looked at or considering looking at in this kind of research that you're doing?
Yeah, so I didn't mention this in my presentation, but these 3 plays, they are great pieces of work, but they're just 3 out of over 100 of how Antigone has been adapted. I just saw Charlotte's comment in the chat, and definitely I was very much considering doing Antigone, an African Antigone, because that's all about exactly like Nigeria during British colonization, and that was going to be a really interesting way again to talk about my thesis. But I think in the end I wanted to firstly map different geographical contexts. I didn't want to do just all on, just focus on Africa or focus in one specific area, and I wanted to kind of also move through time a bit as well. So that's why I chose the 3 I chose. But definitely, I mean, Antigone's been reproduced in Inuit communities in Syria, Argentina, India, really all over the world. I mean, it is the most reproduced tragedy ever, to be honest. So it was very hard to narrow it down. But yeah, I think I chose things that I think resonated with my thesis. So.